Okay, so this marks our return to the Old Testament. As I said before, this is almost something as a return home. At least it feels that way. Now, throughout this introduction and reading, we will have you may be able to hear it in the background, some ambient music. It's going to increase its intensity over time, but hopefully it won't be too distracting. Now, this is coming off the heels of finishing about six Platonic dialogues. And that covered the span of maybe 3 months that we spent there on those dialogues. And so, returning here should be a good experience. I think we have about 30 chapters in the book of Proverbs here. And so, this commentary is going to be not just a commentary, but also a reading of. So I'll read the chapter, and then this will be followed by a commentary, and we will go verse by verse. So welcome to this voyage, and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice and judgment, and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, hear the instruction of your father, and forsake not the law of your mother. For they shall be an ornament of grace unto your head, and chains about your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, consent you not. If they say, Come with us, let us lay a wait for blood. Let us lurk privily for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them up alive as the grave, and whole as those that go down into the pit. We shall find all precious substance. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in you lot among us. Let us all have one purse. My son, walk not you in the way with them, refrain your foot from their path. For their feet run with evil, and make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird. And they lay wait for their own blood, they lurk privily for their own lives. So are the ways of every one that is greedy of gain, which taketh away the life of the owners thereof. Wisdom crieth without, she uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief palace of concourse, in the openings of the gates. In the city she uttereth her words, saying, How long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you. I will make known my words unto you. Because I have called, and you refused. I have stretched out my hand, and no man regarded. But you have set at naught all my counsel, and would none of my reproof. I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you. Then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. For that they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would not of my counsel, they despised all my reproof. Therefore shall they eat of the fruit of their own way, and be filled with their own devices. For the turning away of the simple shall slay them, and the prosperity of fools shall destroy them. But whoso hearkeneth unto me shall dwell safely, and shall be quiet from fear of evil. And so that concludes chapter 1. So starting with verse 1, we're just going to go through these one by one. Not all of them surely will require significant commentary. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of King David, king of Israel. Now something to understand, I think, before we begin here. David was the second king of Israel, Saul being the first. And Israel's descent, we can call it, into the kingship was against the wishes of the prophets of the day. Now David was a good and righteous king. Solomon was wise, but yet he had, which is common among relatives and of the firstborn, we can say, of a king, that they don't necessarily live up to their father in certain ways. Now, in certain respects, Solomon outdid his father in terms of his capacity for unification and the conquest of new land, the building of new projects and temples and things. But he had this insatiable lust, and thereby I think he had part of this, what we might call a disease that plagues those that follow great kings. A desire to show up and to reach the heights of the previous king or of the father. And they do it in such a way that they want to be unique and they want to be different, but often I think they ignore the things that had led them to success in the first place. Now Solomon, again, there were many good aspects about his rule over Israel, but certainly aspects that of his character that David did not have. Aspects that were, and that could be considered negative. To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, and judgment, and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsel. So, now although this is fairly straightforward, I think it's important to pause and reflect on why it is important. We're talking about knowing wisdom. Now we've just come off the heels of finishing the Platonic dialogue Theaetetus, and if anything that we can gather and understand from that dialogue and those 18 hours of recordings that were done on it in reflection. I think that knowing is not an easy matter. Moreover, from that, knowing wisdom, I think, is an even more complicated matter. Now, just because it's complicated doesn't mean that it should be dismissed. But rather, I mention it because it is something that should be respected, and it's something that should be taken seriously. Now, this knowing wisdom, instruction, receiving words of understanding, receiving instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, equity, to deal with the young and the simple with subtlety and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise words. So what does this mean here? What does it mean to hear and increase learning? Well, it's not just a matter of hearing as we sit about in our everyday lives. It's, in some sense, we have no choice but to experience the world. We can try and shield ourselves from it and from the information that our body just naturally picks up, whether it be from a somatosensory perspective or the visual or the verbal, the sound. And so when I see a wise man will hear, I see not only the physical organ of hearing, but it implies that he will listen, which implies attention. Now, attention is one of the foundational focuses, I should say, ironically perhaps, of, I think, the Bible and many religious texts. Attention is the thing that we may direct, the conscious mechanism that is the mind. And so if we direct this, and if we choose to hear and increase our learning, thereby keeping in mind that at this time much of the society and surrounding societies were illiterate, but we need not let that get in the way of listening to what they had to say. Much of their tradition, certainly before that point as well, and if we're talking about Solomon and David, this is probably around 1000 BC. Surely we go 1,000 years back before that. It's just an ever-increasing, or I should say, as we go back farther in time, it's up until the point of language. Maybe we can imagine a bell curve of tradition that uses language to store information, uses language and memory, rather than taking information and putting it outside ourselves onto a tablet or whatever. Now, of course, there are benefits to both, and there are downsides to both language and writing. Certainly there was writing in this period. Certainly there were literate people in this period. But I mention this not to get caught up in the analysis of historical fact. I mean to say that the way in which we learn can vary. The way in which we choose to attend to something can vary. And despite our circumstances, where we were raised, what school we went to, we are always able to pay attention. We are always able to self-direct. And through this self-direction, through whatever mode that we choose, albeit certainly it would benefit us to maximize the amount of exposure that we have, maximizing our potential both in ability to listen, ability to read and write, ability to think through complex problems. But to hone in on the point that this is open to everybody. Knowing, understanding, wisdom is open to everybody. We have the mechanism, we have the organs to put the pieces together. A man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. I think of the community. I think of the heads of family. I think of strong leaders, wise counsels. Now, the understanding of a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. The fear of the Lord is the beginning. That is the beginning of knowledge. Now, what might we mean by this? Certainly we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that fearing God is the image of a man that is cowered in the corner, afraid of a person that is going to break into his home and kill him and destroy him. In that sense, this is not the type of fear that we're talking about. But there is a relationship, because just as a man can break into our house, we can be subject to judgment and unfortunate unseen events. And I think that this is the point. It is the fact that the unseen events can happen. And so we fear that which is known by God, but unseen by us. And so we fear God in this way, because the laws that are established by nature and by the divine logos, the directed sway of things, propagates along nature and along the beings that are able to perceive of an existence and being at a higher level. They have consciousness, are subject to their own laws, due to their own perception and experience of the reality that they are thrown into. And so this fear, perhaps, I wouldn't say it's the wrong word to use, but it's not the type of fear that one should associate with control, because we are talking about the way of things. We can just as easily say you should be fearful of touching a hot stove. Now, if we say it in that way, of course it makes sense. If we touch a hot stove, it's going to burn us. And we must know, or we must be weary and understand, even if we weren't the ones that lit the burner. We have to understand that there's always a possibility of the stove being hot. Of course, that's a very limited example to all the various possibilities of how the law of the conscious being can restrict his motion, can limit his efforts. beyond his perception or beyond his understanding. And it is due to this fact that he must remain humble, first and foremost. And through his humility, he must also understand that he has a responsibility to continue to learn of all of the things that have the potential to burn him. And in this way we fear the Lord. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now they don't want to learn because they are set in their ways. They feel that they know everything. And in their knowing, they make missteps, and perhaps quite serious ones. And it doesn't mean those that are selfish and those that are pious won't equally run into challenges in life. This is one of the unfortunate circumstances of our condition here, our experience in our lives, that even those that don't take interest in these matters can almost seemingly be paralleled in their susceptibility, where we would wish, as we increase our righteousness and piousness, that we would lessen our risk. And to some degree that's true, but with, the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that it extends to righteousness. With great righteousness and great piousness comes great temptation. My son, hear the instruction of your father, and forsake not the law of your mother. For they shall be an ornament of grace unto your head, and chains about your neck. Now, unfortunately, we are all I don't want to say victim, but we all find ourselves within the age that we find ourselves in, and as such we are under the guise, maybe not guise, but I'll stick with it, under the guise of the cultural ideas and the opinions of the day. And it's difficult to remove oneself from all of these influences that, without proper context, don't necessarily seem bad in and of themselves. And let me give you an example. When I first read this, I'm rather ashamed to say that the first thing, or one of the first things, perhaps not the first thing, but shortly after I read it, I had the thought, it occurred to me, well, what if your father and your mother are evil people? Or they are not the type of people that wish to nourish their child. And when I say that there is a certain error culture around people, the age in which people are integrated into, I think that this sort of deductivism, worst case scenario type thinking is a product of that. We can call it postmodern person and postmodern thought. Now I recognize it, and I'm quick to move beyond it. And while I think what it means to move beyond the hypercritical is to solve the criticality. And in order to solve the worst case scenario, worst case scenario here is to say, okay, well, if this is your dictate, then what about this worst case scenario? What can be said of your dictate then? And the answer to that is obviously to flip the view. It is to say, okay, well, what should a father be? What should a mother be? What ought a father to be? What ought a mother to be? What ought to be the role of the child in relation to the appropriateness of how a mother and father ought to behave? And I think of the father, we can think of the person that guides. It is the strength in the family, provides protection, a source of wisdom, discipline, authority. On the other hand, the mother, equally important. Qualities such as nurturing, compassion, love, emotional support. Now, two sides of the same coin. Without one side, you don't have the coin. Now, I'm sure that there are many things that we can say about the mother and the father beyond those distinctions, but I think it's sufficient for now. Because together, they provide a balance of strength and gentleness, discipline and compassion, guidance and emotional support. And it contributes to the holistic well-being of the child. And if we are to forsake either the mother or the father, we will not be brought up in such a way as to be considered holistic. We will not have the appropriate hardware to handle the reality that we're thrown into. We would not be able to handle what it means to fear God. We would not be able to handle God itself. It says, "For they shall be an ornament of grace unto your head, and chains about your neck." Now it's important to understand and to consider the ornament. The ornament is draped around us by those that love us. In this situation, remember, we're talking about this context of the mother and the father draping the ornament around the child, symbolically. In this purpose, I am imagining here has to do with the gift of identity. Now, identity is no small or trivial matter. These days, we struggle with identity. I struggle greatly with identity. It involves connectedness. It involves the idea of the self. To identify something is to, I think, inherently categorize something. Partly, it is to identify the elements that make it a thing. It is to give an account to that thing, which would define its boundaries, define how it's different from something else. And again, the ornament that ought to be expresses the individualism that has received discipline, strength, guidance, compassion, love. It has received the virtues of the parents. And this all forms the identity, the conception of the self, and its relationship to everything else. And our experience with the infinite and the divine is just this way. As we move into adulthood, our relationship with our parents is one thing, but then our relationship to the Father as we age, again, the divine logos, the intelligibility of our experience and of all experience, is at another level. This is where our parents get the ideas, the beliefs, the customs that are necessary to raise the child. That gives them the understanding of what it means to be and to provide love. It is that relationship with the Supreme Father, we can say, that enriches us, that provides ornamentation for our own hearts and our souls. For they shall be an ornament of grace unto your head, then chains about your neck. Now these chains, my primary interpretation here, it could be two, I recognize. The one that I'm most leaning towards is restriction. I think chains as you chain a slave or you chain an animal. And just as we discussed fear as potentially being a negative term, but in reality is actually more a term of practicality than anything, and reason. In just that way, these chains, I think, are a matter of practicality and of reason. There must be limits on the self and the identity. It must be grounded, it must be held to account. And as long as it is held to account, and it is not continually trying to liberate itself from itself, then it can be a thing. And so my primary interpretation here are that the chains are of restriction, but of necessary restriction, because otherwise we spiral off into their darkness. We can find ourselves in the pit of Sheol, which is this confused, darkened state of consciousness where nothing makes sense. It's in this place, it's truly fearful, in sort of the negative sense of not knowing who or what we are or what surrounds us. It's this profound anxiety, this existential dread and nightmare, this continual descent. The other interpretation is that it's another form of saying or of expressing ornamentation. But I really don't think that this is the case. Now for the next several verses here, we have a description of what happens or what we should avoid falling into. And what's interesting here is the flow of this is sort of from, we start from a man, and then we go down into a child, and it seems like we're being brought up through adolescence. And then we are forced with the consequences of our decisions later in life, as with the woman in the street, which we'll get to. My son, if sinners entice you, consent you not. If they say, come with us, let us lay wait for blood, let us lurk privily for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them up alive as the grave, and whole as those that go down into the pit. Now, fairly straightforward. You want to avoid those that are after the darkness. Now, I'm debating whether or not I should indulge in, perhaps indulge is not the right word, but to satisfy the part of myself that is asking a question. It's asking me, again, just like before, and it's not a bad thing to ask. I think the more we ask, the more we can understand. And certainly it is not an asking in such a way as to attempt to deceive myself or to subvert that of the text. It is the ask out of genuine curiosity. To many, it may seem strange that one would ask, why? Why should we not consent to the enticement of the sinners? Why is it bad to lurk, to lay wait for blood, to not have cause to harm the innocent and yet do so anyway? Now, I understand this is the first chapter of Proverbs. There are many chapters. I think there are 30 in total. And we can walk ourselves into many different conversations, many different paths of reason, and I think they may be fruitful. But I also don't want to spend forever on chapter 1. Now, that being said, let's try and place some stakes in the ground, provide us with some structure, some stability for our temporary home, this tent that we are constructing, much like the wandering Israelites. Why is it that we should not consent to the enticement of sinners? We have to ask ourselves, what is sin? Why is sin bad? Well, sin is a form of disobedience. Well, disobedience to what? It's a disobedience to your Father. It's a disobedience to your righteous Father that actually does know what's best for you. And this disobedience, certainly not every sin has its equal effect. They don't all equally separate or serve as a barrier to separate us from God. They don't all equally do this. They don't all equally limit our personal growth and salvation. But they do limit our growth and salvation. And since this matter of personal growth, spiritual growth, and salvation is such a large matter that I think it takes a proverb just to identify it. Just to point out and say, hey, don't walk with them. Well, why? Why shouldn't I walk with them? Well, let's just not walk with them for now. Let's stay here and chat for a while. And so, just like with the Psalms, these proverbial Old Testament books are a slow march. They are very much a slow march. We shall find all precious substance. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in your lot among us. Let us all have one purse. Now, what does that remind us of? Certain events of the 20th century, maybe? A certain type of thinking, the 19th century? Perhaps political systems that start with a C or start with an F. Just as it applies to the level of the population and of the nation, to the body of a people, it applies to the heart and the soul of a man. My son, walk not you in the way with them, refrain your foot from their path. for their feet run to evil, and make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net has spread in the sight of any bird. And so what does that mean? Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird. The bird likely moves quickly, too quickly for the spread of a net, and it's unable to be caught. Now what is this bird? What is this thing that flies away from the net? Now the implication here is that the ones that run to evil are the ones that cast the net, but they're unable to catch what they throw the net over. And yet they may spill blood, they may take their little trinkets that enrich them to a certain degree, and yet they can't catch the bird. And the bird, just as in Socrates' aviary, is an analogy to knowledge, to knowing. Perhaps that is something that it applies to. It is an enlightened way, a way of being at the end of that path. And I should say that at the end of the path of pursuing righteousness rather than pursuing the evil. They lay wait for their own blood. They lurk privily for their own lives. So are the ways of every one that is greedy of gain. So, an excellent passage here of your consequences have actions. And they lay wait for their own blood. They lay wait. This is, again, referring to what we discussed earlier about that of attention. What we orient our attention towards is the direction that we will go. Now, if we walk in the direction of evil, evil is what will find us. It's what we will find when we walk that path. These actions will ultimately come back to haunt them. And this lurking privily for their own lives is the type of selfish behavior that will only yield isolation. This marks a new day. Often I'll record these over multiple days. Most of the time I don't say anything about stopping or beginning anew, but today I think is a good time to say that this is a new day. It's a different feeling to this day than days past, but not necessarily out of the ordinary. You know, in the past, I should say, a couple of years. No, it's been longer than a couple of years. In some sense, it's been, I can almost say, my whole life. It's not quite, but to a degree it has been my whole life. To a degree it is the lives of others as well. The thing that I'm thinking of. You know, it's interesting the way that we see it, the way that we see things. Some of us struggle, and some of us do not. You know, we are quick to move ourselves into the land of the object and say, well, there are many different factors why that might be. IQ certainly has something to do with it. Their socioeconomic class has a lot to do with it. Their background has a lot to do with it, blah, blah, blah. All these reasons. But never you hear it from a personal place. And perhaps we have our reasons, but this is us after all, isn't it? I mean, we can't just stay cold and dull forever. We have to integrate something into our experience. Perhaps that's harsh. Perhaps there are many things, I should say, that we integrate into our experience these days, but I don't know if anyone can deny how shallow it's becoming. And so there is a particular thing that I am thinking about. I'm not exactly sure if it's God. This thing that I'm thinking about. I think it might be. But I'm not really too sure how to hear it. You know, the more I read, the more I verbalize into a microphone for my own enjoyment, the thing that I am thinking of seemingly becomes clearer. And I increasingly become frustrated with my lack of strength. Because as the scope of understanding increases, the understanding of the weight that we are under also increases. But I should say, perhaps that statement in a different light. I feel under a particular weight because of the way that I see things. Committed as I might be to seeing, the more that I feel that I can see, the less I want to. Or rather, perhaps the desire and the faith is there. Again, to correct myself, to reorganize this speech, I think that it is there, the desire. But what I see allows me to become susceptible to certain things. Certain things, no doubt, that were plaguing me before. Certain things that can still yet plague me. And I think to myself, I understand. I understand that wisdom crieth without. I understand and I hear the voice of the woman in the street. I mean, she's crying in a place for all of us to hear. Surely all of us can hear her. She's at the center. She's at the gates. She's constantly uttering her words. She's calling us simple, lovers of simplicity. And those of us who can't quite stop thinking, those of us who constantly are in a state of disdain, others that constantly believe that things and other people are worthless. People that hate knowledge. We all hear her. She's there every day in the streets. She's there in the streets of our hearts, in the streets of our minds, speaking loudly for all of us to hear, perhaps more intimate than we would wish. Now, she's not just condemning us. Certainly, we have had the days where we have felt her offering, reaching out the hand, that we may go with her and listen to her, see what she has to say. Why is she saying these things about us? Why is she saying these things about me? Why can't she just leave me alone? And when we reject her, we refuse her hand, we have decided not to listen to her in the way that a person cannot listen to somebody who is screaming in your general direction. The screaming and the cries become louder, and what we hear is more ominous. We hear these splitting attacks, these attacks that are very personal, as if she knows us better than we know ourselves. And she mentions that we are afraid of something. But we are so afraid of something that we would let it, and we would want it, perhaps, for it to destroy us, for it to bring desolation. And she says, when this happens to you, when you are in distress and in anguish, you'll call upon her, but she says that she will not answer. And so you and I, all of us, we are left with what we have refused to face. We have refused to accept. We have feared wrongly. We have feared for our own comfort and our own security, under the blanket of our own ignorance. And in the path of our own greed. And this, a thing that can happen just as easily as the sun rises and the sun sets, it can fall upon an individual as it can fall upon a nation, or in extraordinary circumstances, everything all at once. And so this thing I'm thinking about, I hear it. And I want to hear it rightly. Why I have barricaded myself in a house, away from the woman in the street, I don't know. But I'm beginning to taste and feel what it is like for the fruits to sour. Without proper direction, following a selfish way, the way that is not, as opposed to the way that is. And what complicates matters, just as I use this analogy for different things, but just as a river has its tributaries, just as a blood vessel has many extending branches, just like a tree descends into many roots, I am, and we are, to some degree, in this way. When our eyes are off of the main river, off of the main artery or vein, off of the trunk, off of the unified bits, we are left in pieces. And for the pieces of ourselves that we say and that we lift up, this is something that I'm doing good at, we cover in its shadow everything that is unhealthy, that is further breaking apart, that is further extending into disillusionment, nothingness. Now, of course, at the end of the line, away from the center, we should have an ear. We should be paying attention, because we can still grow our roots. In a way, this analogy can be used in many different ways. We can flip the analogy and say, well, we can still grow our branches and all the subsequent branches, but still maintain our roots. And in this new context, to grow our branches into the darkness and the unknown, we see more, we provide more shade for the rest of us, that we may eventually share in prosperity with others. But there's a dark side too. There's always a dark side. Again, the analogy that can be flipped. Interesting how we can do this with language. That again, when we elevate the things of our pride, we lose sight of all that which we still have to sow in order to reap the harvest. And certainly there are times when we lift too high and praise too much and say, this is what I have accomplished, that we forget what we are even trying to accomplish, or what we are trying to accomplish for. And I think in these moments, when the selfishness fades, they can either be an exhilarating, blissful time, or one of complete and utter despair. It's heaven and hell. Certainly an interesting time it would be to see that. But we need not wait. We have the capability in ourselves to see heaven and to see hell. Now we may, especially in this modern, materially successful society, we may have plenty that choose to blind their eyes, even though we are headed straight for a cliff. There are those who will have their blinders off and will prepare for it. And there are those that will choose to keep them on and not understand what's happening, or they can't see themselves even flying off the cliff. Perhaps they will feel themselves, but they will not be able to see it. And there are those that have gotten off, have chosen to jump out. Just as this can happen to a society, this can happen to a man. He can go through life waking up and going to sleep, medicating himself so he doesn't have to face it, so he doesn't have to ask himself the questions of why and what for, asking himself about his burdens, not knowing that they can be seen as a restraint or as wings to fly to heaven. But whoso hearkeneth unto me shall dwell safely, and shall be quiet from fear of evil. So this is chapter 2. My son, if you will receive my words and hide my commandments with you, so that you incline your ear unto wisdom, and apply your heart to understanding. Yeah, if you cry after knowledge, and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver, and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you shall understand the fear of the Lord, and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord giveth wisdom, out of his mouth cometh knowledge and understanding. He layeth up sound wisdom for the righteous. He is a buckler to them that walk uprightly. He keeps the path of judgment, and preserves the way of his saints. Then shall you understand righteousness, and judgment, and equity, yeah, every good path. When wisdom enters into your heart, and knowledge is pleasant to your soul, discretion shall preserve you, understanding shall keep you, to deliver you from the way of the evil man, from the man that speaketh froward things. Now, when I read that initially, I thought that was forward, but it is froward. It is of a person difficult to deal with. Contrary. Who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice to do evil and delight in the frowardness of the wicked, whose ways are crooked, and they froward in their paths, to deliver you from the strange woman, even from the stranger which flattereth with her words, which forsaketh the guide of her youth, and forgetteth the covenant of her God. For her house inclineth unto death, and her paths unto the dead. None that go unto her return again, neither take they hold the paths of life. that you may walk in the way of good men, and keep the paths of the righteous. For the upright shall dwell in the land, and the perfect shall remain in it. But the wicked shall be cut off from the earth, and the transgressors shall be rooted out of it. And that concludes chapter 2. So this book, much more, it seems as though it's getting heavier, the content. The Psalms were pretty heavy in their own right, but I think we have to imagine that after King David, King Solomon, like I said at the outset, he had a particular taste for life, and I think that it included a little bit more evil than David. He had a taste for women, he had a taste for expansion and more imperial concerns. He had a lavish taste. Now, there's nothing wrong with building temples, but I think he conscripted many, if I'm not mistaken, 30,000 Israelites away from their families and their busy lives, whether it be farming or making a living, whatever it is, to construct his and to work on his projects. Paying them, but paying them little, and again, forcing them to do so. Certainly after David, and this is the pattern that we see many times after a successful king, emperor, pharaoh, where you see the hereditary succession strong there. It's often the case that the next in line, the next of kin, are not up to snuff. They are not at the level of the successful leader that was before. And as a result, there is this decline. And no doubt the decline is often, and both imagined and I think understood, that it is a desperate time, it's a chaotic time, pieces are falling apart. It's a sort of a force that pulls things away rather than unite. And in these periods, these revolutionary periods, I think certainly a lot of this language is appropriate. Certainly, this language is appropriate as it relates to the individual. I mean, all these teachings have some to do with the macrocosm as much as they do the microcosm. It's funny how many layers our human experience is found in. And I think that today, I sit here talking in June of 2023, I think we're close. We're getting closer. I think we're in a revolutionary period. How exactly it'll play out in the modern day with the modern context and gadgets and all this sort of thing, what this will mean for our governments and for us as people, it'll be a difficult time, I think. But assuming we make it through, fine, we don't screw it up too bad. There need not be some of these civilizational threatening wars. But if we're able to sit down for a moment and just think about it, I think we'll be alright. I think it'll be a lot of difficulties, a lot of breaking down things, and reorienting ourselves, understanding things in a new way, and then building back up. I don't think that it'll carry on for too long. In the modern context, with the speed of information that's being shared, I think it'll be quick. It'll be a stab to the heart. It'll be the death of what is, and quickly after that, the birth of something new. My son, if you will receive my words and hide my commandments with you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding. If you cry after knowledge and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you shall understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. So what can we make of these few verses here? The first seems simple enough, undoubtedly harder in practice than it is seeing it written. Receive my words and hide my commandments with you. You keep these commandments with you so that you know that you have some guiding principles. Now, to incline one's ear to wisdom, this is something that we talked about in the last chapter. It is a matter of orienting one's attention to hear the right things, and to apply the heart, which you might see as the seat of all desire, the thing that can at times deceive us, fool us into thinking that it wants some quick fix. But the heart itself knows not of the desires and the wishes of the soul. The soul, I think, what it wishes, if it can wish in such a way without the heart, I think is to encompass that part of itself, perhaps that lower limbic system, into something of a broader and richer design. If you cry after knowledge and lift up your voice for understanding. Now I think of a few things here. I think of Genesis. I think of our introduction to this experience. The inevitable grasping for knowledge against the authority. And you have to wonder about this direction, because it's almost as if it was inevitable for this to happen to man, that he would be deceived, and that his downfall would be because of his continual reaching and his lack of understanding. But if we are after understanding, if we are to be the inquisitive bunch, and if we lift our voices for understanding, that is, again, we are inquisitive and we ask questions, then the understanding comes, the understanding of the fear of the Lord. And then that fear is the fear of, one possible way to describe it is the fear of one's judgment in the face of the unknown. As one begins to know things, one begins to understand that there are many unknowns. And through the dimly lit and dimly figured unknowns, among the dimly lit knowns, I think it's a bit fearful. especially if we choose to move out into it. But I don't think it's bad to move out into it. It means we need to be strong and upright in order to avoid the pitfalls, avoid the inevitable traps. This fear of the Lord when we were younger, we would fear our parents. We would fear because of the understanding that we did something wrong. We fear them because when we did the thing, at the time, we felt no particular way about doing it. For if we truly felt that what we were doing was wrong, we wouldn't have done it. And the fear only comes when we betray the truth. And in that betrayal, we understand. It's a difficult relationship to find ourselves in. But I think this is unfortunately the case of many. And it's not necessarily that it's a bad thing, but this fear is necessary. It is required of us to learn and understand what is and what ought to be. A child may fear his or her parents, but if they are good parents and they practice strategic discipline, the child and the parents will surely love one another. Now, verse 4, before the understanding of the fear, if you seek her as silver, and search for her as for hidden treasures. Now, this female representation of knowledge and understanding, why might that be? What does the female mean in symbolic terms? What does it really mean to seek her as silver and search for her as hidden treasures? Again, we are searching, but now this wisdom, this thing that we were crying out for, is in the form of a female. And again, I ask, what is the form of the female? Surely there are many things that we can say. Many things that are desirable, such as silver and hidden treasures. What we are after is love, protection to a certain degree, maternal love, we see, I think, in this symbolism, wisdom, a guiding force, offering insight, discernment. Perhaps within this archetypal representation we can add intuition, the emotional aspects of our experience, the heightened sensitivity to what is fine, empathy, compassion, emotional maturity. We're looking for something that will receive us, that will take us in. and as she accepts us, nurtures new life. Of course, this pattern is not just a physical pattern. It's not a pattern that can only find itself in physical means, but rather for growth of the spirit and personal transformation. New possibilities. New possibilities given a particular context. Remember where we came off of chapter 1 with this woman in the street. For the Lord gives wisdom. Out of his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He lays up sound wisdom for the righteous. He is a buckler to them that walk uprightly. So a buckler is a shield that's sort of worn around the forearm. So obviously this is saying that while this God, again, this thing that we are trying our best to identify, just as in the Psalms, it is a very slow march to outlining exactly what it is that the conception of God is, but with understanding and knowledge, or I should say, the flow of understanding of knowledge comes from this source, the name that we contribute to this thing which we call God. And we also understand that this God has some force in our everyday experience. Whatever this observed thing is, we are claiming, or the authors are claiming, that there is a protective capacity, and there's a capacity for provision of knowledge, wisdom, understanding, and protection for those who walk uprightly and follow certain laws. He keeps the paths of judgment and preserves the ways of his saints, preserves the way of his saints. Now a saint is considered to be a saint for his profound devotion, his piousness, observed throughout his life. Then you shall understand righteousness and judgment and equity, every good path. You know, we finished Plato's accounts, his thoughts on epistemology. Now, it's not totalizing. It was the first dialogue that introduced epistemology in the sense of knowing, understanding what exactly it means to know something. A foundational dialogue. It's followed up by subsequent dialogues, but we have taken a break there. But I bring it up just to express that each one of these things that are mentioned, the understanding of righteousness, judgment, and equity, these are, and to put it in this way, suggests a lot, because each one of these words are loaded with quite a bit of meaning. And what we have here so far, I don't want to say quite superficial, but it is shedding a light on something that is readily understandable. Now, those that are in complete darkness would be surprised probably at reading such a thing, that if one is to pay attention to a sort of thing in a particular way, they will uncover these things, these massive, the massive concepts for which we use certain names, such as justice or judgment, justice and judgment, righteousness, equity. And so, to return to the thought of Plato, I bring that up to say that, again, understanding these matters is difficult. And the fact that they are thrown around here without that level and degree and discipline of defining the terms, I think prompts us to exercise patience. Because if it is all to be found here that we are speaking in broad concepts and terms without any actual understanding of what these terms are, then we would be seriously impoverished. But I think, just as I outlined on the series of the Psalms, it is the slow march to understand these concepts. There is no rush. And over time, eventually, the definition begins to... So I've taken a moment to pause and to satisfy the call at the door. I'm sure that the satisfaction can be heard through the microphone. So let's see, what was I saying? So the definition of profound terms or concepts. This is something that we should place in our minds and keep always at the forefront, so that we are ready to explore them, even in the most subtle of verses, perhaps like the next one here. When wisdom enters into your heart, and knowledge is pleasant to your soul, discretion shall preserve you, understanding shall keep you. And so what might that mean? So what I see here is an orientation. Certainly there are those that do not value knowledge. There are those who feel as though knowledge is not pleasant to the soul. And I think this describes a type of orientation that is antagonistic to the type that can know such things as righteousness and justice. Discretion shall preserve you. So discretion can be described in a few different ways. Discretion can be characterized by a type of behavior. To be reserved and to not cause offense. To exercise caution, wariness. And in another sense, it describes the freedom to decide what should be done in a particular situation. It gives us choice, option, judgment, preference. And so from these, perhaps we can understand this exercise of weariness within our right to choose what should be done from our own will is a thing that keeps us. It keeps us in such a way as a as the method of preserving food in a jar keeps and preserves the, what would you say, the vitality, the consumability, the usefulness, the utility, the purposefulness of the food within the jar, or the food in general, so that it may be consumed later. So it shall keep you, it shall preserve you. Behaving in this way, by acting with care and good judgment, will prolong your life. It'll keep it purposeful. And so let's pause. I made such a deal about making statements about big terms. Let's define a few of these. Let's briefly look at righteousness and judgment. So we have to understand that the seeking of wisdom and understanding and knowledge, these are the foundations of what we would consider to be one to live a righteous life. And so to be righteous is maintaining oneself by certain set ethical standards, by principles, many of which have been stated up to this point in the sort of the biblical, not necessarily chronology, but the flow in which the Bible is placed in. Righteousness is about sincerity. It is not just the identification of this being right, of seeking understanding, but also the actual belief and the sincerity that this pursuit is actually the right thing to do, and it is not something that one does in order to gain some advantage over somebody else, or to satisfy the ego, so that one may look good in the eyes of another human being. Now, judgment refers to the ability to discern, to make wise decisions based on knowledge and understanding. In the Platonic context, to make something a true statement, it is to judge rightly with an account, to have some account and some observation of something, whereby we sort of almost intuit a judgment. We make a quick judgment that is beyond the more contemplative aspects of our reason. Then we exercise patience, and then we give it a further account. We give it further distinction. And in so doing, we are more likely to understand what is true, that our observations actually match up with the conclusions and the direction that we choose to move towards. Good judgment includes the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil, to make decisions about what is just and fair. Judgment is about accepting and choosing the right path to walk, seeking guidance from the ultimate, making sound choices. To deliver you from the way of the evil man, from the man that speaks froward things, who leave the path of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice to do evil and delight in the frowardness of the wicked, whose ways are crooked, and they froward in their paths. These are the people that are contrary. They're perpetually contrary. They're always against the thing that ought to be, the thing that is. It is a perpetual denial to walk in these paths. To deliver you from strange women, even from the stranger which flatters with her words, which forsaketh the guide of her youth, and forgetteth the covenant of her God. For her house inclineth unto death, and her paths unto the dead. None that go unto her return again, neither take they hold of the paths of life. And so what is this warning about the strange woman? Now it's identifying a pattern. There's a particular way about this woman. Just like there's a particular way about the crooked and froward person that walks in evil. What does it mean for this woman to be strange, or of the stranger that flatters? Why is the stranger and this particular type of woman contrary? Well, we have two things. The relationship here between man and woman is meant to be a sacred thing, and that if it is done rightly, if it is bound up in the proper context with the proper laws, it's geared towards the production and the preservation and cultivation of new life. In other words, for growth. Not only do they participate in the growth of a child, but also in the growth of each other. It's part of the purpose of the institution of marriage is to grow and to become one and to grow in that unity. But the strange woman, to be delivered or to be saved from the strange woman, what is the stranger? The stranger is somebody from the outside, is somebody unknown. Now that there are many unknowns, now of course we know from this poem that not all unknowns are bad, because to a certain extent our entire lives must be committed to understanding and knowing. So, to say that all unknowns are bad or evil is just not true. But to say that some unknowns are evil and dangerous, I think, is true. So how can we identify and characterize the stranger that potentially can be harmful to us? Well, I think this is where the statement in verses 10 and 11 come into play. When wisdom enters into your heart and knowledge is pleasant unto your soul, discretion shall preserve you, understanding shall keep you. Discretion is important. It is the exercising of caution against that which can potentially pervert one and walk down an evil path. And in such a way, we save ourselves, or rather we prepare ourselves for the potential of something bad happening because of the stranger, we have to identify that there is the positive and negative components. We have potential for new perspective, transformational change, but we also have the influx of destruction, disease, death, corruption. But in the context of these passages, we are talking about the potential negatives. It's obvious in verse 16 when it says to deliver you from the strange woman, even from the stranger which flatters with her words. Now the flattering is a deception. It is the intent of bringing one into the strangeness, or the oddness, the unknown. And in so doing, once you're in this place of unknown, you're in the darkness. Then she has fulfilled her purpose. And in verse 17, which forsaketh the guide of her youth, and forgetteth the covenant of God. So no longer are there pillars of light. There's nothing to support anything. So this reminds me of sort of the behavior of a witch, which tempts one into this state of confusion. It is a degree and type of sorcery, we can say. The psychological disruption and disorientation. For her house inclineth unto death, and her paths unto the dead. So that's pretty bad. If you find yourself talking to a woman and she has on her mind things and behaviors that would lead to death, let's say a particular type of drug use, particular type of a way of life that just over time leads to poor physical health, poor mental health, and eventually leads to something as destructive as death. For her house to be inclined unto death is essentially a worshipping of death. That is, that her place of safety, her place of familial interaction, the place where love can be facilitated, the fire of that emotion and reasoned aspect of our experience, it is perverted in her home, but rather it's inclined towards. That means it looks up to, it worships death, which is inherently a lower thing. Now, death in and of itself, just like the idea of the stranger, is not necessarily bad. There are positive and negatives to that which dies. Death is a constant of our experience, not only in the physical realm, but also in the spiritual realm. There are things about ourselves that must die in order for us to be born again and born anew. Certain ways of behaving and certain ways of thinking that are antagonistic to that which will provide us with the best outcome in the sense of living a fulfilled, righteous, just life. But there is also in the context that we experience here, the death that is premature. It is the silencing. It is the quieting of an otherwise curious and faithful mind. None that go unto her return again, neither take they hold of the paths of life. And so this is just it. It is the stasis, the prevention of motion along that righteous path. that you may walk in the way of good men, and keep the paths of the righteous. For the upright shall dwell in the land, and the perfect shall remain in it. But the wicked shall be cut off from the earth, and the transgressor shall be rooted out of it. And so often with this type of language, we can see the illustration. Again, the explicitness of, well, okay, we understand that actions have consequences. These actions and these consequences apply as much at the macro level as they do at the micro level, as much as at the level of nations and of races of people, right down to the soul and the heart of an individual person. So how is it then that a person can find themselves in such a way to perceive the patterns such as these and navigate oneself through it so that they can remain in the glory of the light, let's say? To know, and even in a state of profound confusion, what the right course of action is. The set of tools by which we can make ourselves and our families prosper. And not just materially, but prosper in terms of the expansion and depth and breadth of the soul, and thereby of understanding and knowing. So that will conclude the first episode of the Proverbs. A rather rocky start, perhaps. I think some good things were said here, but I think once we get into it, like I said, there are, I think, about 30 chapters of the Proverbs. We will try our best to enter into the state of mind that is necessary for change. We will get into the personal sphere, correct certain fundamentals that need to be corrected, make recommendations that need to be recommended, and to try in all faithfulness to follow up on them. And so that is my prayer of closing. So we will begin next time with chapter 3.